I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar. My name is Tara Sklar. I am a professor of health law and the director of the Health Law and Policy program here at the University of Arizona, James E. Rogers College of Law. I also have a position as the senior faculty advisor for telehealth law and policy with the Arizona Telemedicine program. And today's webinar is part of an ongoing series on improving access to quality medical care. We'll be discussing advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in healthcare leadership as part of today's talk. Next slide, please. Great. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone who has joined us, and especially those from Arizona and the Southwest region. I'd also very much like to thank our panelists, as well as our behind the scenes Arizona Telemedicine team with Chris Stewart, Chris Martin, and Mike Holcomb. You guys are just a joy to work with in every way. Thank you. Next slide. We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of the indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes. In Tucson, that includes the home of the Tohono O'odham and the Yaqui. We are committed to diversity and inclusion. The university strives to build sustainable relationships with the sovereign Native nations and indigenous communities through educational offerings, partnerships, and community service. Next slide, please. So since 2011, the Southwest Telehealth Resource Center has partnered with the Arizona Telemedicine program to bring over 185 informative webinars. So this is just one of the many that you've heard over the years for those of you that are regulars. Today's webinar is a little bit different in that we're working with both the Health Law and Policy program at the College of Law, as well as with the Drug Information Association, and specifically how this ties into diversity, equity, and inclusion in healthcare. And it's great that this can also be offered as the DEI credit for continuing medical education. So a number of things happening today with this webinar. Next slide. Great, so just a few housekeeping items. You may have noticed that your microphone has been muted, but we do strongly encourage you to use chat from now and throughout the session, and to check chat as well, as we'll be posting links throughout the webinar. We plan to answer as many questions as possible during the webinar. However, if we don't get to all of them, we will follow up afterwards in an email. We'll be having what we call a soft close, where we'll end right about 1 o'clock. That we want to be sure to answer that pending question before we sign off. The webinar is being recorded. You can access it on demand. There's a link right there, URL on the slide. And so just use that going forward if you want to access this webinar again or share it with colleagues or friends. Next slide. Great. As mentioned, today's webinar is offered as for a DEI credit with the UA College of Medicine, which includes the faculty, residents, graduate resident assistants, and TAs, along with the University of Arizona staff. You must register for DEI credit. So you can do so by clicking on that link in the slide or scanning that URL, the QR code there. We will show this slide again at the end of the webinar, but please note that you have to be registered while the webinar is live in order to receive DEI credit. So putting this right in front of you as much as possible. Next slide. Great, so today's topic and panelists, which I am delighted to moderate, will focus on a wide range of approaches to diversity, equity, and inclusion in healthcare. We have from the legal and compliance perspective with Brian Santo, Dr. Elizabeth Koplemsky will be talking about disparities in telehealth accessibility and efforts to overcome them. And then we have a wonderful alum of the Arizona Law, Janae Foster-Holkins, and she works with Business Roundtable and will really bring to the table a broader discussion about racial equity and justice and what some companies are doing in terms of best practice in this area. So I'll start by introducing each panelist, and they'll present for about 10 minutes, and then I'll introduce the next, and then we'll end with a Q&A. To begin, I'd like to introduce Brian. Brian possesses over a decade of in-house counsel experience, He has done everything from people leadership and client management experience, including subject matter expertise and contracting, data licensing, data privacy, human resource issues. He is the corporate compliance person to go to. He serves as the Associate General Counsel and Compliance Manager for the National Committee for Quality Assurance. So he is based in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, he worked with Booz Allen Hamilton and worked on a number of government and commercial contracts. Most importantly for us, he has extensive experience teaching online at law schools from George Mason to Duquesne to now with us at Arizona Law, and he'll be leading a course this spring on DEI in the health sciences. So welcome, Brian. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I also like to show up a minute or two late to keep everybody on their toes. So that whole daylight savings time and calendar invite, I think, got me a little bit. Anyway, thank you all for joining. Can you see my PowerPoint? I tried to do it full screen earlier today, but it was locking up on me. So hopefully this is sufficient for you guys to be able to see it. So, all right. So I am going to talk about legal considerations in the DEI space. We're going to focus primarily on employment law matters, but I'm going to also talk, this is healthcare, right, about the provision, access to care, and those considerations as well. So the healthcare industry is no different than other industries and sectors that need to improve and prioritize what I like to refer to as cultural competence. You know, responding appropriately to people of varying backgrounds, in a way that recognizes them, to make them feel respected. And these DEI issues are pervasive, not just in employment law settings, so healthcare company workspaces, but the industry writ large, that is provision of care, access to care. And if you've taken a health policy course in your life, you know what the social determinants of health are and how inequities and inequalities in our culture, based on laws throughout the decades, can affect the health outcomes of different protected classes, age groups, races, income levels, you name it. So off we go. Since I'm the first one who gets to speak today, I'm going to give a refresher here about what we're really talking about: diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm not going to read through these definitions verbatim, but of course, diversity is differences, and that's differences in race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, etc. Equity, the processes and programs focusing on impartiality, fairness, and equal outcomes for everybody as much as possible, but also trying to overcome barriers and identify the causes to these barriers and prevent them from happening in the future. Finally, inclusion, right? Ensuring that people feel a sense of belonging, kind of like that cultural competence that I just spoke of. Promoting equal opportunities in the workplace, overcoming barriers so everyone can achieve success. All right, turn into the thrust of the 10 minutes I have here, the employment law as related to DEI. And everyone back in everyone's mind, more and more, especially with COVID and the vaccination mandates, a little off topic, but Title VII Equality Act. So Title VII, everyone, if you're not familiar with it, protects those in employment. So you're being hired while you're working, what your wages are, your conditions, your privileges, being discharged, promoted, or otherwise, for certain protected classes. And that's going to be race, color, religion, sex, national origin, pregnancy, and more recently, back in 2020, a Supreme Court case solidified protection for gender identity and sexual orientation, okay? There's exceptions to it. For example, religious institutions, if you go to a Catholic private school, if you're a Catholic private school, you can hire all Catholic employees if you want, subject to certain nuances. So that's the big one, right? That is going to protect employees, and that includes paid interns, temp employees, on these protected classes as related to employment. The Equality Act. So this has passed the House of Representatives. It's been trying to get enacted as a statute for many years, still needs to go through the Senate. And what this does, or what it is intended to do, is going to amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And it builds upon that ruling in 2020 that I just spoke of, the Supreme Court ruling. It's going to make it explicit that the non-discrimination provisions for the LGBTQ plus community in employment settings. And it's also going to apply it to other areas of life, be it housing, the jury system, public accommodations, facilities, education, anything that gets federal funding. You're not going to be able to discriminate on those protected classes. So some other big laws that are heavy hitters in this space, the ADEA, Age Discrimination in Employment Act. I am a protected class of about a couple months ago, right? I'm 40, age 40 and over, protected, covers private employers, 20 plus employees, state, local governments, labor unions. The ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. So you have a disability as defined by the statute and applies to private businesses with 15 more employees. And the big key here is this law has really put more accessibility into play into the workplace. So as an employer, you need to provide reasonable accommodations. And those reasonable accommodations are balanced against what might be an undue burden to the employer to provide it. So you don't have to provide every accommodation that is asked, but this has led to things that you don't really think about anymore. That's just commonplace. Automatic doorways, ramps, wheelchair in public places and businesses, okay? Equal Pay Act, men and women, doesn't have to be the exact same job, identical, but they have to be substantially equal. I skipped over that affirmative action plans, so I'm going to spend a little more time on those because that's a big one. And it really goes to the heart of DEI. So affirmative action programs, businesses that receive money from the federal government, okay, it's not all, it's 50 plus employees, and I believe it's $50,000 now of any money in any fiscal or calendar year, have to have an affirmative action plan in place, okay? It's not a requirement, others should do it and implement it voluntarily. And how this really works, guys, is at the end of the year, you submit to the Department of Labor a spreadsheet that says for every protected class or age group, race, color, religion, I interviewed this many people, I hired this many people, I promoted this many, I let go this many. And the premise is really that if there wasn't discrimination in your workplace, that your employee profile and those that you interview, hire, or otherwise is going to reflect the broader labor pool in which you're sitting in, right, in your locality. All right, shifting a bit away from an employment law. DEI and the provision of care, because we're talking healthcare here, right? So Title VI, it prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, also applies to LEP, limited English proficiency, and any program that receives federal funding, federal financial assistance, okay? Medicare, Medicaid, okay? Both programs where you're gonna receive federal funding as a health plan, a provider of care, or otherwise. And I have here, bias isn't enough. Well, there's a lot of provider bias, okay? There's studies done that say white women are sad. Black women over-report things, over-report their symptoms. White men are more apt to sue. So these beliefs and attitudes aren't discriminatory on their face, but if it starts to impact, say, the quality of care or the quantity of care, then we have an issue. So maybe going back to my examples or that study, maybe you're not going to order tests for Black women because you know what, they're just over-reporting their symptoms. Or you're going to order excessive tests for white men because you want to cover your CYA for the most part, because you want to order every test. So a white man's not going to come back and say, oh, well, I'm going to sue you because you didn't order all these tests. This happens all the time, okay? Section 1557 of the ACA, Affordable Care Act. It's the non-discriminatory provision. And all those laws that I just spoke of have different titles to it, Title II, Title III, Title IV, within the ADEA, the ADA. There's a Rehabilitation Act that I didn't speak of that deals with disability and use of federal funds. But this section of the ACA builds on all those long-standing non-discrimination laws and says you can't discriminate in the provision of care for any healthcare program or activity. All right, executive orders. Most of you probably have heard of them, familiar with them, but the Constitution gives the president the ability to oversee and direct various aspects of the executive branch. When it's signed, it's a directive, and it regulates the federal government's operations. It's not legislation, it doesn't need congressional approval, but they are directives that need to be followed. So these two you see here are more recent, January and June of this year. And it only applies to federal agencies, as you see here. But we've seen, just as the EO related to the COVID vaccination for government contractors, right, affects millions of people. So I think as we talk about DEI and other initiatives, and these both here are obviously related to DEI initiatives. You can kind of read it for yourself on the slide because I'm sure my time is running out. I see Tara just like, let's get going, Brian. But it's directing these federal agencies to promote DEI, all right? And I see this stuff flowing down to contractors more and more, which is going to place not only a burden on them a little bit from an operational perspective, but of course improve DEI in culture, which of course is a good thing. And no lawyer would give a presentation if it wasn't going to present some type of counter argument. So, when you put into DEI programs in place, even with the best intentions, you need to be careful that they're going to be legally defensible, that they're compliant with federal and state law. So you need to remain cognizant of your Title VII duties, all right? We can talk about reverse discrimination, those that are not within those protected classes. But the EEOC, which oversees these civil rights laws in the workplace, says, hey, you can adopt these DEI programs, you can adopt the affirmative action plans, but only when they don't trample the rights of the non-targeted groups, okay? So you have to be careful because mostly when you put these programs together, you're gonna want to show your employees that it's working. And how do you do that? Usually via quantitative means, okay? So you want to be careful not to set these rigid quotas or set asides for certain protected groups that have to be hired, okay? You want to review those programs regularly to make sure you're meeting your goals, and those goals may shift. And of course, communication. Communicate about your program, its goals, like I said, but reiterate that discrimination is not tolerated under any circumstances. So as in life, communication usually is always key. So I feel like I tried to get a lot in there in about 10 minutes, but thank you for your time and I'll turn it back over to Tara.
Oh, that was great. Thank you, Brian. Just a really excellent overview of the legal landscape. I enjoyed your real world examples. I appreciate the counter argument. And I just think this is a notable time to host a webinar given what's happening with the federal government and the evolving executive orders that are coming into play. So thank you so much. Please stick around for questions. And I will now introduce Dr. Elizabeth Kropinski. She is a professor at Emory University in the Department of Radiology and Imaging Sciences and the Vice Chair of Research. She is also the Associate Director of Evaluation for the Arizona Telemedicine Program and co-director of the Southwest Telehealth Resource Center. She is past president of the American Telemedicine Association, president of the Medical Image Perception Society, and past chair of the Society for Imagining Informatics in Medicine. She serves regularly as a grant reviewer for the NIH, Department of Defense, and other federal, state, and international funding agencies. She also serves on a number of FDA review panels. Many of you may know that Dr. Kropinski and Dr. Weinstein have been doing research and publishing scholarly on telemedicine papers for over 25 years. They are co-directors of the federally funded Southwest Telehealth Resource Center, which is headquartered at the U of A. And Dr. Kuprinsky frequently commutes from her home in Atlanta back to Tucson, but I think her and I and many others are finding that we connect via Zoom quite more often and frequently now. On a personal note, I always enjoy and learn so much from Elizabeth's presentation. So I now turn it over to you, and thank you for joining us today.
Great, thank you so much, and good afternoon, I think, for everyone. So that's a really great talk, and it kind of leads right into mine, which is on talking about disparities in telehealth, or trying to overcome the digital divide. Now, no matter what you call it, telemedicine, telehealth, digital health, virtual health, e-care, eye-care, remote consultation, it's all essentially the same thing. It's delivering care utilizing telecommunications technologies and a lot of other tools associated with that. Now, you all know we've seen an incredible increase in the use of telehealth, sort of prompted by, or actually forced by, COVID. This is a graph from McKinsey & Company that shows, back in January and February of 2020, things were just kind of piddling along at the slow increase that we've been noticing for the past, say, 30, 50 years in telemedicine. But boy, March hit and wham, exponential. Everybody just said, wow, we got to figure out how can we get to and contact our patients, and how can we continue to provide care when everybody has to stay at home, locked down, and basically not go out. And so we saw a huge increase. It did kind of go down once we got, past that sort of peak, and people started to figure out, how we could still see people in person. But if you notice, what it did was level off at about 38 times higher than what we were experiencing in January and February. And that has not changed. That has pretty much been maintained since February of this year. And current rates of utilizing telehealth in just everyday healthcare is, again, about 40 times higher than what it was at the beginning of COVID. People figured out it works. We have well over 30 years of peer-reviewed publications on telemedicine, but it took a pandemic for people to say, oh, okay, yeah, it works. We're satisfied with it. It actually does have good outcomes on patients, and it improves efficiency and cost. So we figured all that out, and we're moving ahead. What it has done is created some disparities, unfortunately, as well. And part of it has to do with the technology, unfortunately. I mean, we talk about telemedicine as being, healthcare for everyone, anytime, anywhere, or everywhere. You can kind of put every instead of any, it goes either way. But unfortunately, what COVID did was really highlight some of these digital disparities. And we knew about them beforehand, but they really were exacerbated, I think, during this quick adoption of telehealth. Now, at least 21 million people in the United States lack broadband access. And that's a disturbing figure. You watch these commercials from all your telecommunications providers, and I won't say whose, but they provide these pretty yellow maps and pink maps, and they show, wow, we've got everybody covered. And then when you drill down on a particular region, you can start to see the gaps really quite readily. And these are in places where you wouldn't even imagine. So it's not like out in the middle of nowhere. I go down to the end of my street and I don't get signal, or I go into my lab at work and I don't get any signal either. So it really, unfortunately, affects those who we want to reach out most to with healthcare. The digital divide really affects underserved patients, especially those in rural areas. And again, if you kind of match up those pretty yellow and pink maps to rural versus urban, you'll see kind of where the disparities occur. Interestingly, about 81% of the US population owns a smartphone. And you think, hey, that's great. We can just, everybody use their smartphone. The problem with that is, well, what smartphone version is it? Does it have video capability? Does it have streaming access? How much data do they have? There's a gap, and that gap is across literacy, socioeconomic status, and don't always have access to other devices. If I'm on a data limited plan and I have a choice between downloading the latest in Netflix and binging on a series or talking to my healthcare provider, some people make different choices and they may choose Netflix and not their doctor. There's what we call the mobile first population. And this is, sort of the Generation Z, I guess they are, who rely solely on their device for internet access. And interestingly, it is largely from racial and ethnic minorities. So it actually gives us huge opportunities to reach out to these populations because they also tend to have worse outcomes. So we just have to figure out, and I think leadership in telehealth and leadership in DEI can help figure out this dichotomy between people having the devices, but are they the right devices? And do they know how to prioritize and use them for healthcare purposes? Because it is a huge opportunity, but I think a lot of people don't realize what those opportunities are. We also struggle with digital health literacy. This is across healthcare, but especially in telemedicine, where we're utilizing these digital devices. Basically, digital health literacy is the degree to which the patients or anybody can obtain, process, understand digital services and information. It really becomes important because we're dealing with apps, we're dealing with digital information, patient portals, just all sorts of different technologies and ways people can get at that information. And people talk about it as if, yeah, just log into your patient portal. It's not as easy as people think. If you're lacking in digital literacy and you don't even know what a patient portal is or how to set it up, it's a barrier. And there are a lot of barriers to understanding all this, passwords and safety and security and PHI and, privacy policies and, proper and effective use. Why can't I just hook up to my provider, as I'm in my workplace? And why do I have to go through all these crazy things? I talk to grandma on Zoom every weekend. Why can't it just be like that? And that's the kind of things that we've got to overcome with addressing digital health literacy issues. And so we need to figure out what those lacks are in digital health literacy and figure out how we can educate our patients and our providers about how we can overcome some of these challenges. And this is really not often in place. A lot of times systems are set up, whether they're the apps, the portals, information, and so on. One size fits all, in my opinion, and one size does not fit all. And I think that really is where we run into some of the major problems. We need inclusive designs. User interfaces can be quite complex. And data burden entry can be a burden. I've got patients where I want them to upload maybe their weight every day, their salt intake, their diet, their blood pressure. Depending on the device and the app that's being used, the portal, whatever, these interfaces can be quite complex and hard to use. And it becomes even more complicated, say, if I've got a hearing problem, or I've got a vision problem, or I'm disabled. How do I get that data into that device when it's one size fits all user interface that's maybe not so one size fits all, because nothing ever is. Also, the language. We're supposed to create apps and tools basically geared at the 6th grade level. And a lot of these tools and apps aren't, because they're developed by people with PhDs and masters in engineering and so on. And so they don't really always take it into account, the different populations. So we need user-centered designs, and they've got to be driven by an evaluation of the users and the tasks that they've got to complete. We've got to incorporate the users into the design and the evaluation of these tools before we actually put them out there in the public. I've been through any number of developments of electronic health records, and it's always on the provider side and whether or not they can have access. It's rarely on the patient side and involving the patients in the evaluation of, say, the patient portal. It lacks a focus on culture, on literacy, and numeracy limits the benefits of increased data access. It worsens inequities. So although the intentions might often be good, a lot of the tools that we're developing for healthcare, for telehealth in particular, really do exacerbate some of the problems that people are having because they're not culturally relevant. And language barriers actually exacerbate all of this. There's many languages that are spoken. And without incorporating that into these tools and apps, it really does miss a lot of populations. It's very common to translate things into, to say Spanish, but what about all the other languages that are out there and all the other populations? You'll see regional pockets of tools being developed, but it certainly isn't uniform. And when a patient is not in their home region, they may be accessing tools or their portal, and it's just simply not in their language. And even if they've, a PhD or an MD, if you don't speak the native language, it really can become an issue in trying to understand what's going on. So what can we do? There's a ton of stuff we can do. We can talk to government, and government can promote things like interoperability, favorable policies like the ones that Brian was talking about for digital health. Further efforts like the national class standards and classes culturally and linguistically appropriate services in health and healthcare. And there's a huge set of standards. If you just Google that, you'll find that this has been thought of. But the question is it really applied, even though it's a quote unquote standard? Vendors, to me, they're sort of the worst offenders. They really have to be taking on, their leadership has to take on the mantle of developing linguistically and culturally developed tools that are really tailored to specific populations and people. And you've got to engage researchers and patients in usability evaluations. Institutions, these healthcare institutions, invest in portals and apps that really do address the needs of the underserved. When you're considering hiring or contracting to get a particular device, it should be part of your evaluation criterion and acceptance criterion that the tools you're purchasing or going to be using do not exacerbate the digital divide, but address things like cultural and digital disparities. We need to integrate these better into our workplaces. The clinical teams, you have to offer and encourage digital options to everyone. And this is all patients. You can't just sit there and assume Mrs. Jones is 70 years old. Yeah, I'm not going to offer a telehealth option to her. She's not going to like it. She doesn't know how to use a smartphone. She probably knows far better than you how to use a smartphone. So we can't prejudge our patients and their willingness or ability to engage in telehealth simply because of their background, their culture, their age, their gender, whatever. And patients have to get involved and advocate for digital health equity in their health care. This is a really nice framework that was developed by the American Telemedicine Association for limiting health disparities using telehealth. At this point, it is just a framework, but what I like about this diagram is it shows all the different areas that we need to concentrate on in order to eliminate health disparities utilizing telehealth. We need to think creatively, maybe device loans. If patients don't have the proper smartphone, maybe we can pair with grants, foundations, and get people phones that they can use for their healthcare. The community can have hotspots for awareness, access, libraries, community centers, churches, homeless shelters, volunteers, state fairs, you name it, local events. All of these places can be ways to let patients access healthcare providers digitally by setting up little kiosks. Get your trainees involved, your residents, your medical students. We have had our residents and medical students during COVID, and there's a ton of publications. The programs that these kids have developed to outreach with telehealth is amazing, and it really is great. We need to think broader than age, race, and gender. There are folks with disabilities, mobility issues, home situations. When you think about telehealth use, you've got to adapt your tools and resources to a wide variety of different populations. And again, you can't just ask, do you have smartphone or broadband? It's much more nuanced than that. How old is the smartphone? How many people are in the house using that broadband? If you got, 3 kids doing their homework or doing their classwork, how much broadband is left for you to interact with your provider? These are the types of questions that we've got to ask, not just do you have a smartphone that you can access. And you need to consider the entire patient-provider environment technology ecosystem together as a synergistic unit, not just separate pieces. These are a bunch of resources that are available to you to talk about some of the issues in telehealth and digital equity. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Oh, that was excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Kapinski. You covered a lot of detail, and I just want to note how so often people refer to telehealth as increasing greater access, but you've really highlighted how that's not the overall issue, and it's really about overcoming these digital health issues in a number of ways. And I love how you highlighted what can we do, and I really appreciate the questions and comments in the chat coming in. This is a perfect segue to now turn it over to our final panelist, Jonay Foster-Holkins, who will have a lot of information on what we can do, particularly from a business perspective. Jonay is the Senior Director of Policy for Business Roundtable. In this role, she oversees the Roundtable's racial equity and justice policy agenda. Before joining Business Roundtable, Ms. Holkins was counsel for Congressman David Cecilian, where she managed his Judiciary Committee portfolio, including civil rights, criminal justice reform, election security, immigration, intellectual property, and police reform. She was responsible for analyzing legislation and providing policy recommendations on issues specific to healthcare and financial services. Prior to moving to Capitol Hill, she was a senior litigation associate for the firm Feldman, Tucker, Leifer, and Fidel. And there she represented community health centers and other federally grantees across the country on a range of constitutional and admin immigration issues. I mentioned earlier that Jonay is an alum of Arizona Law, and she also happens to be one of my very first health law students way back in 2010. So I'm enjoying this in every way. And Jonay, please let us know what's going on with Business Roundtable.
Yes, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I really appreciate that. As a U of A law grad, it's cool to be back in this space and being able to share the work that I'm doing at Business Roundtable. So I joined Business Roundtable this year, actually, to oversee the Roundtable's racial equity and justice policy agenda, and really seeing this as an opportunity to really drive real change on issues that the business community hasn't traditionally weighed in on. And so just to give some perspective of what the Business Roundtable is, it's an association of over 230 CEOs of America's leading companies that are really working to promote a thriving US economy, and part of that goal is expanding opportunity for all Americans. Our member companies employ more than 20 million people. And so when you think about the power that the Roundtable has in advocating for policies, I think that's very important, especially when you think about all the employees that they represent as well. As a CEO organization representing pretty much all sectors of the economy, we know that we are uniquely positioned to take action and bring about real change on the racial equity and justice issues, and really working to advance racial equity. I think a huge part of why Business Roundtable got into this space is unfortunate and tragic. It was prior to the killing of, it had to do with the pandemic and looking at the inequities that existed and just how the pandemic was unfolding. And then also we had the killing of George Floyd, which really, I think, was a catalyst for the business community to stand up and kind of do more on racial equity issues. But I will say that prior to the killing of George Floyd, Business Roundtable had already begun to do diversity and inclusion work, and had already identified that as a core value of just corporate governance generally. So, but that work really did take on a new urgency in 2020. And when the protests erupted around the continued police killings of Black men and women, the the roundtable knew we were aligned with our stakeholders and wanted to speak out on the issues. I'm really proud that the Business Roundtable did, take an immediate stance, and we began to advocate for bipartisan policing reform legislation. And that's something that we continue to advocate for. I know it's not directly a DEI, maybe not telehealth related, but it certainly is related to the health of communities and for those who are in those spaces. And so it's something that we continue to push for. We've had very many meetings with congressional offices, and it's a #1 priority for us. And so, but that's not where we didn't stop there. We continue to think about how can we do more to address issues that are central to fairness and equity in our economy. And that led us to the racial wealth gap. And so that is the racial wealth gap. When you think about it, it's really a product of hundreds of years of policies and practices that have denied economic opportunity to Black Americans. And over time, those harmful policies and practices, they lead to significant disparities, which we are witnessing today. And it's with that understanding that last year, Business Roundtable's Special Committee on Racial Equity and Justice released a set of corporate actions and public policy recommendations. And those were really focused on 6 key areas: employment, finance, education, housing, justice, and then healthcare, which is a huge part of why I'm here today to talk to you about what we're doing in the healthcare space. From the health equity perspective, we know that implicit bias in healthcare can adversely influence care and outcomes for people of color, and that disparities in health conditions and outcomes can be exacerbated by inequities to access to care, as well as care delivery. And with that, looking really at the diversity of medical profession too, I think that plays a huge role as well. So our member companies are large purchasers in the healthcare system. They work with a variety of different partners to provide care to their employees. And because of that, the Roundtable really has a great platform to convene and share business practices that some of our member companies have been doing to help reduce implicit bias, increasing options for culturally congruent care, and then also working towards reducing disparities to improve health outcomes just across the board. And so as part of our health equity efforts, we wanted to make sure that we're creating a forum for members across the different industries to convene and to be able to share how they engage on health equity issues. And for some of our members who provide health plans, as well as some of our other healthcare partners, they're also in a position to share out on their DEI practices of their organizations to provide healthcare services to employees and discuss the ways that they're promoting DEI and how they deliver services. And so these discussions have been really insightful for me, and I'm very happy to kind of share out on some of those examples with you today. Before I jump into that, I want to just give a broad overview of social determinants of health, which has been a huge part of the work that we're doing. SDOH, or social determinants of health, those are conditions and environments where people are born, live, learn, work, play, worship, and age. And those are areas that affect a wide range of health, functioning, and quality of life outcomes and risk. That's how the federal government defines social determinants of health. And within those SDOH, within SDOH, those can be grouped into 5 categories. So economic stability, education access and quality, healthcare access and quality, neighborhood and built environment, and social and community context. So some examples of Business Roundtable member company efforts include improving or really using a data-driven approach to advocate for addressing the whole health of a person. And that includes thinking about the physical, emotional, financial, and the social and environmental factors. One of our member companies, Cigna, has developed a proprietary social determinants index that characterizes a community for social determinants of health at the census tract level. And that SDI, or the social determinants index, was really built for the purpose of understanding the potential health disadvantages that an individual may experience based on their geographic residence, and being able to use that data to support their efforts in terms of how they partner across the entire health system, as well as to identify and address the social determinant factors which fall outside the traditional care or the scope of traditional care. In particular, Cigna is using their SDI to identify under-resourced communities within their markets where overall health status and utilization are impacted by SDOH, and identifying where additional resources may be needed to be deployed to certain communities as well. They're also using it to improve identification of customers who are at increased risks for poor health status and utilization based on their residence. And looking at also how to increase engagement in programs as well to support customers with resources that they may need so that they're obtaining the best health outcomes ultimately. We also have another member company that has really prioritized housing needs. And so when you think about the SDOH or social determinants of health, housing is, of course, a very important lens, very important to making sure that you're addressing the whole health of a person. And if there was ever any doubt about the link between housing and health, I think the pandemic has really made it clear that safe housing must be a part of the conversation for advancing health equity. So I want to just spotlight, I know I may be short, I need to cut this short, but spotlight one more member company, CVS Health, who has done an amazing job at really trying to address housing insecurities and promoting community health improvement in vulnerable populations. They've invested over $114 million in affordable housing last year, and those investments will lead to the construction and rehab of more than 2,800 affordable housing units in 30 cities across 12 states. And they're working very closely with community organizations to provide those affordable housing options and services to people who are facing challenges. And I think it's an amazing effort. They so far have over 460 permanent supportive housing units that will be constructed to provide some stable homes for people who are experiencing homelessness, affected by chronic disease, victims of domestic violence, and those who are in need of behavioral health or addiction treatment are able to access that as well. I have a lot more to share, but I also see the clock, so I'm going to cut myself short. But long story short, I'm happy to continue this conversation, and I look forward to the questions.
Oh, that was great. That was the perfect tying this together with social determinants of health and how that absolutely relates to health equity. So thank you. And thank you for providing those examples from your member companies. I think that often we focus so much on the legal issues or what isn't working that we don't realize how innovative the private sector can be. We had a really interesting question come in regarding advocacy and its role in leveling the playing field. And I can let all the panelists answer that. It's interesting how, you know, and my role at the law school, my role in research in general, is I often think about how the law can help, you know, improve equity issues or address disparities in care, or where it acts as a barrier. And certainly it's done both in telehealth for a very long time. And COVID's really expanded and changed that conversation. But I think when we think about advocacy, it's both from a legal realm as well as in the private sector. So maybe I'll just let folks on the panel speak to that question of the role of advocacy, particularly as we are going to be changing, well, we may be changing administrations in the future. Just how can we keep up this conversation about DEI in healthcare going forward? And I see, Elizabeth, you've gone off mute, which is the signal to say you have something to share with us. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think, advocacy, people tend to think two things. One, oh, well, gosh, everybody knows it's a problem, so they don't really need to hear my voice. And then the other one is, oh, nobody's, if I say something, nobody's ever going to hear it. I work with a lot of societies, and they're always asking us to get out there and sign letters, get them to your Congress people, and just make them aware of the issue. And people are like, yeah, I get this stupid form letter back and I know nobody's listening. And I try to say, no. People are listening. It may not be your representative, it's their staff, guaranteed, but they're the ones who are dedicated to that issue. And so I think it's a matter of, you just have to get out there and do it, because that's what puts the face on a problem. And it really is that personal touch, that face that somebody listens to. Because once you become the advocate, people start to listen. And congressmen and legislatures, they read the briefs, but what sticks in their head is the person that comes to their office and told them their story. And that's where advocacy, in my mind, comes into play, is putting that face on it and getting the people who really care to get out there and spread the word.
I completely agree with what Elizabeth just said. As a former Hill staffer working on these issues, I know firsthand that those stories and that advocacy, even if it's a form letter, it matters, right? And being effective in your approach also is important. So I think continuing to advocate for some of these things is very important. At Business Roundtable, we to that point, we recognize that the private sector can't do it alone. And even thinking about some of the benefits that our member companies offer has been helpful in trying to advocate for certain reforms, especially with respect to telehealth. And so thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic and how we really did turn to telehealth as a way for our workers, for our employees to access health services when they didn't feel comfortable going into a health facility, or maybe they had a disability and it's not easy to get to the health facility, especially during the pandemic. Maybe services were shut down that they would have otherwise relied on. And so telehealth services have been a valuable tool for many of our member companies and being able to provide benefits to their employees. So we've been advocating for an expansion of telehealth, the telehealth provisions that were part of the CARES Act to be expanded permanently. I think that is something that we have really tried to vocalize on the Hill, and making sure that folks know that we are in support of expanding the provisions or keeping them in from how it is during the pandemic, recognizing that there's still an equity issue that we will ultimately need to resolve with respect to access to health services more broadly speaking. And so, but it's still an important step in terms of making sure that the law isn't at least a barrier to accessing telehealth services.
Yeah, and I'll just expand a little bit on both of those. Elizabeth's points, one of the big things in corporate compliance is salience, right? It's much more impactful to see a commercial on TV. You can throw statistics and numbers up on the screen on a commercial, but as soon as you put a face to it, babies crying or otherwise, that provides salience to the legislators. Currently there's no legal requirement to implement DEI programs. I doubt there ever will be. I don't know if AAPs will ever expand to that beyond the 50+ employees and having those things. But I think what I've seen is shifting in best practices to have an affirmative action plan, to have DEI programs. Some will do it because it's the right thing to do. A lot will do it because of optics, right? And I think it'll cut both ways in that regard. And I see industries and companies that I never thought would have DEI programs that my friends work for that do, because a shift in culture and doing what is right, and or the optics of it all. And to the telehealth piece, I'm not in that space as close as the other guys here, but I've heard rumors of and someone correct me if I'm wrong, Tara, the interstate licensure compact, right? taken those, it isn't a barrier, it's actually, easing interstate practice of medicine over telehealth, but even making it looser, those rules looser. So those are ways in which, we can eliminate those barriers of access to care in the telehealth space.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, this is, we've done talks on, actually, it's a great segue to kind of, thank you to our panelists and to the behind the scenes at Arizona Telemedicine Program. This is a great segue to previous talks we've done on telehealth and how the laws are changing quite a bit as we're moving away from the emergency waivers to actually passing statutes that hopefully will address the the health equity issues with accessing telehealth. So I'm just going to share my screen with some final notes for everybody. Oh wait, sorry, apologies. I need to skip ahead a few slides. There we go. All right, well, this was a great talk. I really enjoyed it in every way. I don't seem to be able to, this is such a weird, my apologies, I'm having technical issues, which is guaranteed, right, in these kinds of talks. But this webinar is part of an ongoing webinar series. There's a link there to access all previous webinars as well as the slides, which I really encourage everybody to do, and also to send your feedback about them. There will be a survey going out specifically requesting your feedback about today's webinar. And then lastly, we know many of you are on the call today because you'd like to receive DEI credit. And I think there's a link there, and here's the code to make sure that will happen for you. I know we didn't get to all of the questions, so we'll follow up over email. And I just want to extend a warm thanks and gratitude for everybody participating in our call today. I learned a great deal, and I look forward to future discussions and advocacy. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday.